This conference will now be recorded.
Thanks a lot for joining. This concept of depth scales is something that I've used for years with clients, and I've written a little bit about it, but I haven't talked a lot about it, so I'm really excited to talk about this with you. And I think that for starters, it's useful to kind of orient um, where these depth scales fit in. And broadly speaking, I'm a big fan of really being creative and effective in ongoing change. So, fundamentally, in digital, we are going to have constant change, and that's part of digital, right? So that's one of the advantages of digital. But a lot of times, change is really handled quite poorly. And so I've got these 8 principles of ongoing digital present change, and the depth scales fit into this. So, the first is we're never done. So there's, way too much focus on launches, for example. Also, there are many types of change. And, launches are just one type, but I've got this grid of different types of change and such. But basically, it's things everywhere from like the redesign down to publishing, and then kind of everything in between. You've got kind of improving the machinery of the CMS over time, et cetera. Another thing that's important in strong ongoing change is to do routine change first. So instead of implementing the next gee whiz feature, et cetera, if you have a problem publishing, for example, then that should be fixed, even if it's not glamorous or whatever. So routine change first is key. And in fact, when thinking about functionality changes to digital presence, one of the key things to consider is there any change we could make to make the routine stuff easier, or routine stuff better, or routine stuff easier to implement in a high quality way. Some of the other principles here is to amplify. So that's basically you want to make highly leveraged changes. So things like instead of making a change on one page, make a change that can span across the entire digital presence. Also, there's way too much focus on these static artifacts about web digital presences. So whether it's intranet, extranet, websites, suite of websites, global presence, whatever, it tends to be a very static view. And similarly, the planning tends to be static. It's kind of like, look, we have implemented, we have developed this definitive target, and here it is, this is it. Everybody blesses it, and then you implement toward it, and of course, the day after, you need to do something else. Then there are other things like, you want to limit one-offs and do phasing rather than big bang. So where did depth scales fit into this whole kind of concept of doing better ongoing change? And it's in this dynamic over static planning. And I think that the way people really look at planning for digital tends to be thinking of it as like this beautiful thing that you're designing. So, here on the left, for example, is this, frozen soap bubble. And it's beautiful and we can admire it. I've used the analogy before, like a model ship in a bottle, right? It's like we're admiring these things. So, it could be the wireframes that we developed that we want the site to look at, to be structured like, or we could have, mock-ups and we want it to look exactly this way. But one notable thing over on the static planning side is we're really kind of looking at this thing from the outside, but really what we're doing is we're like steering the ship too, right? We're steering the development of the website. The website exists with people operating it. And so we have to be ready and assume that we're going to have things that we have to respond to over time. So we really need to be more dynamic in our planning. And when we're looking at depth scales, really what we're focusing on is the items that are going to have the highest impact to the digital presence at large. So if we look at some of the kinds of changes that can be made to a website, for example, a specific single piece of content, the impact to that one single page to the digital presence at large is probably low. Of course, you may have a site that has some pages with very high impact, etc. But in general, a single piece of content has low impact on the digital presence at large. But a feature, so let's say that you're adding the capability to have interactive data charts on pages, and you're going to support that in the publishing workflow, etc. Well, then that is a feature, right? That is going to have high impact. It's going to be on potentially multiple pages, but it also is difficult to implement. So we have to, consider that too, and that's one of the reasons to go through this more dynamic planning too, is that we don't want to just dive into these really expensive implementation, details without really, planning them out. So really, the depth scales that we're going to look at are features and other high impact changes. The ones that, like a specific site, it's less about that. If you have like a global presence with lots of sites, it's less about a single site. It's more about how are we going to templatize sites or something like that, right? So how are we going to make these really big, high impact changes? Even for a small site, it would more be about like the features. And so part of this is also a response to this kind of buzzword bingo approach to talking about what we're going to do with our digital presences. So, you grab a few of these words, for example, here, you put it in an RFP and everybody thinks it's a good RFP because, it's going to be modern and flexible and we're going to do storytelling and things like that. Well, part of the problem is that you have to define what these things mean in, your specific needs. So now we get to the depth scale. So what are they? They're scales that show a range of increasingly difficult and also valuable ways that you could, address something, a specific capability. And you're also using it to indicate like where you are now and where you're trying to go. So here's an example. Here, we could see that from the, well, first off, what is this about? So it's about educating and including the public. So with always in the way that I look at all digital change is that it's very specific to the organization. So again, we're not just playing buzzword bingo here. We're saying like for this organization, it's a financial institution that needs to educate the public more and include the public more. So one of the reasons to embark on this depth scale approach at all is that we want to kind of break down the problem some more. So kind of the default way of doing this would be to say like, okay, we're going to have an education section. So, over here is where we're going to say what, interest rate is and, all these other, technical terms. And, there we go. We can check it off. We have educated people. And over on the right, we go to like every single page has to be rewritten to educate, right? So there's this whole range here. And so what on the left is doing nothing, right? So, no education. And then we move all the way over here. What this fit within, and I'll give one other example, is within defining a vision for a big digital change in this. And so here there were 3 pillars to that change, and this is one of them. And you'll see here this workshop. So this particular depth scale, we had a workshop with the leadership of the organization in order to decide how deeply we're going to do it. It was like option A or option B, right? So that's kind of some context to this. It's like defining what's the vision for a change, and then working with leadership to decide like how far are we going to go. And this kind of executive decision-making workshop is essential for big things like breaking down silos and things like that that really just can't be dealt with at a lower level. So a few things about the depth scale. One is that it is a scale, right? So on the left, we have less difficult to implement. On the right is more difficult. Also, that goes hand in hand with the left being less valuable and the right being more valuable. So put another way, we'd all love to be all the way over on the right. And that's often the way that discussions start, is that some kind of black and white statement is made like, hey, wouldn't it be great if we were more personalized? And it's like, yes, personalized. We're going to be personalized, right? This is a way of breaking down that problem more. And I think it's important to also frame where you are now versus where you're going to try to go and whatever the planning horizon is. So, for example, this one is for the planning horizon of a big redesign. So right now there's virtually no education, and what we're going to work on is this per meeting micro content and summary. So what that meant is, actually maybe I should break down the scale more. So there's no education. There's the textbook education, like I mentioned. Then there's the textbook education and supporting key tasks, like how do I get a loan, and educating on how to do that well, et cetera. The next level up here is that instead of rewriting all these technical documents, to have micro content that describes the types of documents, at least, so that when somebody sees a listing page or whatever, they at least know what this document's even about, right? Even if it's very technical and they won't understand it in detail. And also to have summaries of key documents, so at least people have a sense of what's going on. And then over the right, as I mentioned before, that is, we're gonna, every single page, we're gonna write as an educational page, even these extremely technical financial documents. So anyway, back to this another component is that, yeah, we set where we are now and where we're gonna go. And it really is that a lot of the interesting work is in this middle range, right? So instead of it being that someone just throws out like, hey, let's have a financial dictionary, and everybody says, yeah, sure. You start really breaking it down. You say like, well, okay, we can have a financial dictionary. Well, what can we do more? Okay, we can support tasks. Okay, what about all this, the 80% of the content that's super technical? What are we going to do about that? And then you break it down now. So you slowly, introduce these, these shades of gray throughout. So here's another example. Originally, the goal was to be to have personalization, and so we broke that down. There are lots of ways of doing that, where it says, well, eventually we could have an account, we could make changes based on behavior, we could have specific pages that are that have some level of targeting, we could have at the template level, et cetera. And another reason to lay this out is that it really makes it clear where you are. So sometimes people are trying to go all the way to infinity and beyond, right? But you can't, you haven't even passed go yet. So it's important also just to better understand where you're at. On the nationally ranked, this organization, it was a very large US university medical system, and they were nationally ranked in US News and World Report in a lot of categories, and they really wanted to emphasize that throughout their site. And so, the ideal state would be every single piece of content. So the reason this content is showing something about being nationally ranked is XYZ. But instead we broke it down and we said, well, we could emphasize just the rankings in general on every page, and then we could emphasize the why on some pages, right? So you're really breaking down how this could go. This was another example of the vision having 3 pillars. So here it was nationally ranked, user focused, and evolving. And then we've broken down the problem a little bit more for folks. So this is the last slide, then we can have questions. So again, why even do these things? One is that things change during implementation. So we are more like that kayaker going over the edge of the waterfall, right? Rather than some kind of static, beautiful thing that we assume we can etched in stone and where it'll work forever. So depth scales help when things change. So for example, if we're not able to do all that micro content, well, at least we're going to do the task-based stuff, right? So in the first example, we always have a backup plan that isn't just an all or nothing. It's not just, forget the education, right? We're not going to do it all, so we're not going to do it at all. You've already defined how you're going to back out if you have to. Also, you've really more clearly defined what you're doing, so you're able to evaluate progress better. So instead of one team saying, yeah, personalization's there, and another team saying it's not, you've already broken down what you mean. You've got, I mentioned, like, you've had to go backwards. Also, this helps if you need to do deeper, or you're ready for deeper implementation later. So you've already defined, like, okay, well, we can add this page-specific information more over time. That's our plan if we don't plan more in the meantime. It really encourages creative thinking. This also fits in with my approach on website product management for ongoing change, where you're really trying to break down problems so that you can do something in the next 3 months rather than kind of everything sometime in the never future. And then also, you're just more likely to implement something useful. You're really breaking down the problem. And again, since you're able to back out into something useful, you're just more likely to do something useful. And also you get, just better alignment in the first place. So, Giannis, that's it for the presentation. So if anyone has any
Sounds
questions.
good. Well, I think we already have at least 2 questions that's arrived in the chat. Why don't I pass it over to Carrie Hain, if you can go on mute instead of listening to my voice reading your question.
Hey,
That's
Giannis,
okay.
David.
Hi.
Thanks. This is great. I love the idea of scales and the last thing you just said of do it, whatever you said instead of never. But my question for you was on the slide where you said it's a scale, and you had difficulty and value. Are those just 2 different measurements, or you seem to imply that they go together, but it's not my experience that they always go together. So can you address that, whether though you're putting those together or just 2 different components of the same thing?
Yeah, thanks. That's good. Yeah. So I think that for it to be a productive scale, it's better if you pick things that do line up that way. I find that if things get out of sync between these 2 metrics of difficulty and value, that probably the one that is more difficult to implement but not more valuable probably isn't worth it. So I see it as kind of, it's like, in the end, hopefully they shake down so that the only things on here are lined up on both of those metrics. But it's true that starting off, they might not be, because somebody might be saying, like, hey, what if we did this one implementation and it sounds cool, but then when you think about it, it's like, but wouldn't it still be more valuable if you did it this easier way? And then you just kind of eliminate that one. But I don't know if you have any examples where it just totally falls apart, and maybe, I just haven't seen that.
Yeah, I think what you just said made sense, but because there's oftentimes I look for the things, I think of it more as a quadrant way of looking at it. So you find the things that are less difficult and more valuable, that can kind of get you some quick wins. So that's how I usually think about it. Those things are usually very few. Things fall more like what you said, but so that I usually set this up as a quadrant. So you have 4 things. Avoid the things that are not valuable and difficult, and focus on the things that are more valuable, and then prioritize them accordingly.
Yeah, so I think I guess I'm looking at this as where some of that stuff has already been shaken out. But depending on the situation, it may be that if people are strongly arguing for those things that are difficult to implement and not as valuable, then maybe, that's a great way of showing like, look, you're just way out of line. You shouldn't even be considering this kind of thing. Another thing is that usually these, at least the way I do it, they're multiple together. So it's helpful to kind of eventually have it shake down. But anyway, hopefully we can just some way eliminate those things that are difficult to implement and not very valuable, even though they do come up.
So thank you. Next, I'll pass it from Carrie to Hillary. Hillary, are you there? Hillary Marsh?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So my question absolutely builds on Carrie's, and I think it's just ever so slightly different, which is that depending on who's in the room when you're having these discussions, valuable means different things to different people. So it could be valuable for IT because maybe it makes their work faster or easier or helps them tell a better internal success story. But if marketing, is in the room, they're going to have a different meaning of valuable. If different lines of business are in the room, they're going to have something different that qualifies as valuable. And so I think that to some degree, these need to be weighted somehow, or we need to have multiple opinions, like how valuable is this, or how hard is it? So it's not just a yes, no, it's degrees. And it's multiple people's degrees coming together.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. I think that where I tend to use these are around the visioning step, where it's a little more oriented toward the executive team and kind of the business level of what is trying to get accomplished. And then some of the more detailed stuff shakes out from under that. So having it, so it's a little bit, so that helps to clarify for me, like, how to explain this. Because I think this might be a little bit more for that initial, coming up with that air support from the, executive team on like, this is what we're saying, like as a business is important, and then shake out like, okay.
You still have 7 or 10 people in the room.
Yes.
Who each bring their own priorities and their own perspectives into the discussion. So, for one team, being more user focused is more important for their bottom line than for another team to be nationally ranked. And so, you're going to be facilitating some pretty challenging executive level discussions.
Yeah. So one thing is that these are kind of separately scaled. I should have said that. So and now yeah. So
that's my question, right?
Yeah.
Because which is more important, to be nationally ranked or to be user focused? And so that we can decide that nationally ranked trumps user focused, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So I would say that one is that it's not like there's a line across, up and down on these saying like, well, user focused is like evolving is more important than nationally ranked or whatever, right? Because it's further on the right. It's just saying that this is how far we could go, like, and on each individual scale, how far are we going to go? But with respect to nationally ranked versus user focused versus evolving, that is definitely, well, one thing is that even coming up with what the 3 are in this case, regardless of which one's more important, that's obviously a big prioritization step too, right? Even like, what are the 3, and so yeah, certainly there's a process there too.
All right, very good. Any other questions, comments, feedback, reflections? It seems like this is a good addition also to the consultants toolkit. Perhaps teasing a little bit also because the questions we've had so far have been from consultants. But I do like the point that you made both in the blog post and also here in the slides, that this is all about implementing something useful and getting better alignment in the first place.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think that's certainly something that's relevant for all of us.
Yeah. And then also, again, just to emphasize that other point about, you've also kind of predefined how you could go up or down as things go on too, which is one advantage of distilling it down to a line, right? Is that you've got a little bit more possibility for going up and down the scale too.
So as a part of a project, would your advice be like, can you just share a little bit from behind the scenes in terms of, is this like one pager kind of material, or like what's
No,
the
so
level of, you said it was mainly towards the executive level, but can you just elaborate a little bit from behind the scenes on how involved it is?
yeah, so what I often do is, after first interviewing key stakeholders, so the executive team, and then also people that are responsible for generating content, people that are responsible for particular parts of the organization. Then what I do is define a topic for an executive decision-making workshop. And so there it's saying like, okay, we're going to dig into one of these issues, like one that isn't obvious, that requires executive level support, et cetera. Then I will frame like, okay, well, why is this topic important? What's the current state? What are possible ways of approaching it? How much difficulty, like what would it take to get to these different levels? And then decide where to go. After that, I put together a vision that breaks down like the three pillars of what the vision is. Each one of these gets a few pages of explanation. What does that mean? What do these different levels mean, et cetera? Then usually after the vision is approved, then it moves into, all right, well, how do you pull this off? What are the process, what's the process to getting there? What's the process of sustaining it? So yeah, it's not a single page kind of thing, but there may be a single like index card that people can have on their desk going forward to kind of remember where they are and things like that, right? But as far as developing it, it's certainly more than just one page.
Sounds good. I think that's very helpful. Any closing questions? We have about 1 minute left. If not, I'll just pass it over to you, David, perhaps for a closing comment. I don't know how long you've worked on this. I see the blog post on this topic was from the beginning of this year, from early February, and the world was very different back then. But I'm sure, knowing you well, this is something that's been in your head for quite a while. Any insights here at the tail end of the call you want to share, David?
Well, yeah, I don't know exactly how long this has been in the toolkit, but probably at least 8 years. And I think it's been really useful. But I think overall, the big thing is just to try to be more dynamic in planning. So if anybody has any further questions or comments, then feel free to reach out to me.
That's very good. Thank you very much, David. Dynamic planning, that's, I think, exactly what we need more of. Thank you for finding the time for this. Thank you for going down deep on this topic and also preparing the slides. As promised, I'll wrap this up into a blog post and share it with the wider community. And your email will be there as well, so that people can continue the conversation.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.